Hi, I'm John Gwantner, and welcome to my sake education series. Across this series, we'll be covering a very wide range of sake topics at all levels of familiarity. So if you're even remotely interested in sake, by all means, please click that subscribe button. Welcome to part 2 of the basics of sake. In part 1 of the basics of sake, we talked about what sake is and the 3 things that make one sake better and more expensive than another. Today we're going to be talking about the grades of sake, and then I'll add a few things after that as well. So when talking about the grades of style, rather than actually being different styles of flavors and aromas, they're actually legally defined grades. Certainly, to a great degree, certain flavors and aromas and styles can be associated with each one of the grades, and we'll cover that as well. But the main thing that we're going to be talking about today are the various legal grades of sake and what makes them what they are. To begin with, the legal grades are defined by nothing more legally significant than how much the rice was milled before they began to brew. That's how important the milling of the rice is. In short, and we'll talk a little bit more about it in a little while, more milling removes more fat and protein from the outside of the grain, leaving more starch or a higher ratio of starch behind. Remember, starch gets converted into sugar and that gets converted into alcohol and carbon dioxide. We like starch. And fat and protein, while contributing a certain amount of character, if there's too much of them, they can make the sake cloying and kind of rough. So in milling the rice, the objective is to remove fat and protein and leave only the starch behind. Milling more and more leads to a more delicate, more refined, and if it's the intention of the brewer, it can lead to a more aromatic sake. Milling more does not make a sake unequivocally better. However, it does make it more refined, more elegant, and more delicate. Furthermore, it most certainly makes a sake glitzier. It puts it more in the spotlight, gets it more attention, and it allows it to command a higher price in the market. So those are some of the reasons that the rice is milled to a high degree before some sake is brewed. How do they actually mill the rice? There is a conical hopper that sits on top of a milling machine. And the milling machine basically has an hourglass-shaped grinding stone that spins inside. And the rice in the hopper drops down, hits the side of the grinding stone, and goes around and around and around. And every time it goes around, a little bit more is nicked off, is milled away. And the rice in that machine will go around and around for somewhere between 12 and 100 hours. And slowly, as it does that, it gets milled more and more and more. The way they actually tell how much has been milled is they weigh the hopper. If the hopper were to weigh, for example, 1 ton, and they milled it down to the point where it weighed 600 kilograms, they would know that they have taken away the outer 40% of the rice through that milling process. So that's the way that they actually do the milling. Again, the purpose is to remove the fat and protein that hovers around the outside of the grains, leaving only the starch, which resides in the center in proper sake rice, behind. The degree to which the rice has been milled is referred to as the seimai buai. And the seimai buai is an interesting number. The number that they use to tell you how much the rice has been milled, in other words, the number that represents the seimai buai, is actually the percentage of the original size of the rice grain that remains after milling. Now, we talk about how much is milled away. You'd think that they would tell us the amount that was milled away, but that's not the way the industry works. They tell us what remains after milling. So, as an example, if a sake is brewed with a rice with a seimai buai of 60%, a milling rate of 60%, what that tells us is that the outer 40% has been ground away, leaving the inner 60% behind. And that's a typical milling rate for a ginjo or a Genmai ginjo. A more extravagant example would be a seimai buai of 35%. And what that tells us is the outer 65% of the rice was ground away and not used in the brewing process before they began to use the inner 35% in making that sake. So that's the term seimai buai. You'll probably want to remember that. So let's begin to look at the grades of sake. The first grade to talk about is called futsushu, and actually, this grade is the lack of a grade. In other words, futsushu just means regular sake. And what it means is that this grade has not qualified for a special designation like Honjozo, Genmai, or one of the 4 types of ginjo. So it really doesn't have a designation. Futsushu means regular sake. But that's actually between 60 and 65% of the market that's out there these days. So it's an important classification, even though it's actually the lack of a classification. Much futsushu is very inexpensive. It is not at all flashy, and it can be fairly simple and humble in its presentation, but a lot of it is extremely enjoyable. But I want to emphasize one more time that futsushu is actually the lack of a special grade. Now, it could be that it didn't qualify for one reason or another, or it could be that the brewers just decided not to submit it for classification, not to put a special grade on the label. There's one or two reasons a brewer might do that, and we'll cover those in a later video. But for now, futsushu just means the sake did not or would not qualify for one of the particular special grades of sake. Please take a quick glance at the chart that you see in front of you. These are the basic grades of sake, and I want to talk about each one of them just a little bit in this video here. So you can see that futsushu is at the very bottom of the chart. As you move up on the chart, you'll see two classifications that are next to each other. One is honjozo, and the other is junmaishu. And again, the main legal definition of these grades is how much the rice has been milled before you begin to brew, the seimai buai. Honjozo has a minimum seimai buai of 70%. And you'll remember that means you must grind away at least the outer 30% of the rice before you begin to brew. You can mill it beyond that if you want to, but you have to mill away at least the outer 30%, leaving the inner 70% behind. Right next to that, you see something called junmaishu, and we'll talk about the difference between those as well. However, junmaishu used to have a seimai buai of 70%. That law was eliminated several years ago. So currently, junmaishu has no minimum seimai buai. There is no required milling rate. We'll talk more about the flavor profiles in a minute. If you go up to the next classification, this is the Great Divide. You'll see Genmai Ginjo and Ginjo. Now we're into the realm of Ginjo sake. Now we're into the realm of premium sake. The minimum seimai buai, the minimum milling rate for Ginjo and Genmai Ginjo is 60%. So you must mill the rice down to the point where no more than 60% of the original size of the grains remains. Again, you can mill it beyond that if you want to, but you have to take it down to at least 60%. Going beyond Ginjo and Genmai Ginjo, which is Dai Ginjo, I like to say Ginjo to die for, the minimum seimai buai for Dai Ginjo and Genmai Dai Ginjo is 50%, meaning you must mill the rice down to the point where no more than 50% of the original size of the grains remains. You can take it much beyond that, and very typically, Dai Ginjo is milled way beyond that, 40%, 35%, and even beyond that in some extreme cases. So those are the milling rate, the seimai buai definitions for the various grades of sake. Fundamentally speaking, the higher you go on the chart, the more refined, the more elegant, and the more aromatic the sake is going to be. This doesn't apply to every single sake. There's lots of exceptions. But basically, the more you mill, the more refined, the more light, the more delicate, and very commonly, the more aromatic the sake will be. The next thing I want to talk about is the difference between the Genmai varieties, which you see on one side of the chart, and the non-Genmai varieties, which you see on the other side of the chart. The word Genmai means pure rice, and sake with the word Genmai in its descriptor, in other words, Junmaishu, Genmai Ginjo, and Genmai Dai Ginjo. If the word Genmai is there, that means it's made with rice, water, and koji only. I've got a whole other video about koji, but basically koji is rice with a mold grown on it, and that gives us enzymes that gives us starch to sugar conversion. Koji making is the heart of the sake brewing process, and we'll talk about that at great length another day. But basically, anything with the word Genmai in there means it's made with rice, water, and koji only. No alcohol has been added to the process. If that Genmai word is conspicuously absent, what that tells us is that a little bit of pure distilled alcohol was added to the sake right after fermentation was completed, but before filtering out the rice, and they do that to loosen flavor and aroma. So to make this simple, if you look at the top two grades of sake, you've got Dai Ginjo and Genmai Dai Ginjo. Genmai Dai Ginjo was made with rice, water, and koji only, whereas Dai Ginjo was made with rice, water, koji, and a little bit of distilled alcohol. And again, in the premium levels of sake, they add this alcohol to help release flavors and aromas. They add just a little bit, and it's strictly limited by law, and they add it after fermentation is complete, and it helps loosen flavors and aromas. It's like a crowbar to help you crank out more flavor and aroma. Later, they add a little bit of water to bring the final alcohol content down to about 16%, so that sake made in this way is not fortified. It's just at one step along the way, it temporarily had a higher alcohol content to pull out more flavor and aroma. So these are the various grades of sake. What you really need to remember is the more you mill, the more light and aromatic and delicate the sake will be. And the big difference between the Genmai styles and the non-Genmai styles are whether or not alcohol was added. And do bear this in mind, neither Genmai nor non-Genmai are better. Neither one is unequivocally better than another. Again, I'll cover this in a bit more depth in another video in the near future. The next thing I want to talk about is this. If you look at the various grades of sake, one really important thing to remember is that there's a lot of overlap between these grades of sake. It's important to learn the grades, absolutely, and the rules that apply to them. But there's nobody on the planet who can taste a sake and every single time tell you exactly which grade it fits in. If you're a professional, sure, you can pretty much blind taste a sake and tell which grade it's going to go to. But is there anyone on the planet that can do it all the time, 100% of the time? Not going to happen. The point being, there's a lot of overlap between the flavor profiles of the various grades. In other words, most Honjozo is fairly simple, fairly smooth, and a lot of it is suited to warming. But there's some Honjozo that's very, very aromatic and lively as well. Most Junmaishu tends to be rich, with a lot of umami and a decent acidity, and not very aromatic. But there are very aromatic Junmaishu that are out there as well. Once you get into the top 4 grades of Ginjo, most of that is very aromatic, very light, and very refined. But there's certainly sake in the Ginjo and Daiginjo classifications that are much earthier and full and not nearly as aromatic as you might typically find for that grade. There are certain regions in Japan that don't like to make very aromatic sake, so even their top grades, Daiginjo and Genmai Daiginjo, will not be very aromatic at all. The main point that I'm trying to convey is that there's a lot of overlap between the various grades of sake. So yes, it's good to know them. But it's also good to learn to not pay so much attention to them and to not get overly attached to any one particular grade. You can download the chart showing the grades of sake to which I referred in this video at the URL below. That's it for part 2 of the basics of sake. Be sure to join us for part 3 of the basics of sake, where I cover a few more topics like aging, temperature, vessels, storage, and a bit more. I hope you enjoyed this sake education video, and if you're interested in more sake education videos, by all means feel free to subscribe. Just click that subscribe button. You can learn more at my website, www.sake-world.com, and also there you can sign up for a free monthly sake newsletter, and furthermore, you can access 20 years of sake newsletters at that site. If you've been enjoying sake for some time now, and want to study some advanced topics and learn about what's going on inside the sake industry in Japan, by all means consider subscribing to Sake Industry News as well. Furthermore, if you're just a casual reader, consider subscribing to the beautiful magazine Sake Today. I hope you enjoyed this video and I hope you are interested in more sake education. If so, by all means, please click that subscribe button. Thanks for your interest in sake and thanks for watching. Kanpai.
Thank you.